chaos. On the other hand, I do know what the Second Law of Thermodynamics says, and it's a point well taken. After all, coal and oil are just congealed sunlight from the past, and at the moment we're making a large use of it. It has side effects or externalities, global warming as well. What I'm going to try and do is really just say a few general things about the problems of energy in India, and get on to through a I'm just going to say a little bit about some of the things that have been happening in policy terms over one sector which is actually not the most important thing, which is natural gas in India, where some of the issues of reform and how those might interact with the other issues such as distributional issues, the farmers who are not connected to electricity, for example. You simply cannot look at India only in efficiency terms. That would be far too easy. You have to do some really rather nasty decisions about the trade-offs between efficiency objectives and distribution objectives. And of course economists like me would say there are good ways of doing that and there are very bad ways of doing that. And some of the worst ways of doing that are embodied in quite a lot of the Indian economy as it was in the past. So, context, I was told that this is going to be about nuclear, and I'm actually going to say very little about nuclear. I'm hoping that somebody says, ooh, this is a trap for the speaker. I think Kipling would call it an elephant trap. Or was that group there? I can't remember. All I'm going to say is that worldwide, the Japanese disaster at Fukushima, putting that on one side, it's fantastically difficult to make the sums add up to anything that looks sensible from a climate change point of view, let alone what the scientists would say look sensible from a climate change point of view, without nuclear as a rather important part of the mix, as a non-carbon source of energy. And if you think about it in the Indian context, that redoubles, the problem redoubles. Starting point is not at all favourable from the point of view of the question posed by the organisers of this symposium, that India is actually a coal economy. It's very heavily dependent on coal. I used to say that if you're talking about climate change, there are three numbers that matter, and in order, they are China, coal, India, coal, and US coal. I then bothered, as good scientists ought to look up the figures, and actually that order's wrong. It's actually China coal, US coal, and then quite a long way down actually, India coal. But India is actually a poor country which is using an awful lot of coal, and as I would say, most of the projections looking forward don't actually see that changing. By the way, everybody, the fastest growing fuel in the world, despite all this stuff about climate change, is coal. Wonderful things like shale gas in the United States, guess what it does? It displaces coal out of the United States, which gets exported to Germany because Germany doesn't want to use nuclear power. Net effect on the world is probably just about zero in terms of climate change emissions and so on. So you have a hugely coal-based economy. Another non-emitting version of energy comes from the sun via rain, namely hydro. There's a lot of hydro in India. One of the things I think to point out in the Indian case is that hydro is almost as contentious as nuclear, because hydro does involve very often a great deal of social disruption, displacement of people, all that kind of thing. It's not a simple option at all. Think of the three dams in China, for example, which is a pretty ruthless policy of getting energy more or less at a fairly large cost in human terms. And then remember the standard sort of story which makes these things look absolutely impossible. China needs, in order to keep up with its energy demand, one new Three Gorges dam about every 10 days in order to keep up with the increment of demand for electricity. The number would not be quite as dramatic in India, but I'm just sort of saying these are the kinds of big numbers that are around, and before one starts to specify things like nuclear, I think one needs to know some of the big numbers. How is India going to get its energy as it grows? There are two problems here. One is that India doesn't really produce very much, either oil or gas, not in relation to future needs, and in fact increasingly not in relation to current needs. So there's a huge problem, and one of the potentials is, of course, to get more exploration and development, particularly on the continental shelf, but elsewhere as well, and possibly the development of shale gas, which some people will think might be a big potential in India, possibly bigger in India actually than China, all for the future. And all of these things, as everybody knows, are pretty contentious in environmental terms. But then so is the alternative, which is coal. Very, very contentious. I grew up in the northeast of England, and it's quite commonplace to see small houses disappear into the street, just simply sink into a hole. That was subsidence due to coal mining. Everybody took it for granted. If you go to the northeast, you'll see signs on most roads in particular areas saying, beware subsidence, which means the road is going to be bumpy, that is if there's a great big hole, which it's all the sort of whole car. With fracking, we've had very small earthquakes a very long way down. They seem quite small compared with what I was used to. And in any case, fracking is at a very, very early stage. The chairman now of BG is fond of saying that shale gas and shale oil extraction is basically at the pick and shovel area stage, and that if you apply new technology, recycling materials and so on, there's probably potential there, but it's not there yet. It's a wildcat industry. So you probably need high prices in order to generate the kind of exploration and development that India might have, and this is all potential. It's probably there. Most of it is still not properly explored. There's an Indian policy of trying to encourage that, but that of course means at the margin high prices, at least to the companies. I was asked to talk a little bit about energy security. One of the characteristics of both China and India is a sort of go-out policy, which is to try and get equity stakes in places like Africa or even Venezuela. So the Indian national oil companies are rather busy overseas, and this is usually justified on policy, energy security, energy supply ground. It's a nonsense. It's been tried in the past with oil. The Japanese, before the second oil shock, bought lots of forward oil at rather large premium, and then when the oil price went up, they paid that plus the oil price. In other words, it didn't do anything really to produce much in the way of security. But it may be a good idea anyway to do that kind of thing if you want to develop the Indian companies. Now, on top of all that, sorry, let me just say, there is one silver lining on the sort of big sort of change side, and that is that imported natural gas, which would be liquefied natural gas, LNG, there have been huge discoveries in East Africa. They're not developed yet, but they are actually huge. And all sorts of politicians in Asia are looking at this rather greedily, thinking, right, it's not very far, for example, from India, just put it on ships, take it across, it'll transform the world. But actually at the moment, nobody knows what the cost of this will actually be. And it's certainly not going to be terribly cheap, that would be my guess. Another one which I think everybody knows about is that shale gas, the shale gas revolution in the United States, has meant that gas prices there are extremely low. Gas prices in the world at the moment range from, let's say, $2.50 per MMBTU, don't bother about the unit, but $2.50 in the United States, to upwards of 15 to 17 in parts of Asia, particularly Japan. This is a very important market with all sorts of possible arbitrage coming in. One of the things we don't know about is whether the United States will let the gas out. There is one company, Cheniere, which has permission to turn its gas terminal which was designed and built at huge cost to bring LNG into the United States a few years ago. They're going to turn it around in order to take the gas out again. That's just one company. If they allow a free-for-all, it will lead to US prices going up and Asian prices going down, almost certainly. But that's not certain. In the case of crude oil, the United States bans any export of crude oil, even if they previously imported it. That's a kind of independent sort of energy security policy. They could quite well do the same for gas, or they might do something complicated like auctioning permits. The fact is, we simply do not know, but it's a silver lining that there might be a lot more LNG available if East Africa and other places develop. Now, on top of all this, you've got the climate change mitigation agenda, which means decarbonise. Now, in rough order of magnitude, coal, which India depends on to this very large extent, is twice as bad as natural gas. Hence, in this country, for example, we're probably facing another dash for gas as we close down the coal bits of the power sector and all that sort of thing. And you'll see an improvement in emissions when that actually happens. We're seeing a very big improvement in the United States because gas is replacing coal in power generation. But, very importantly, I've said it before, the coal doesn't just disappear, it goes on the ships, and it goes to, at the moment, mainly Northern Europe, but equally it could go to India or to China, etc., etc. If you're thinking globally, the basic problem, really big problem, how do you back out coal out of the whole energy mix, given that coal is the fastest growing source of primary energy at the moment. Really rather difficult as a general problem. So issues of climate change, which are very much to the fore in India, are complicating this. Some people would say, well, India is poor, and that as a poor country, with relatively low emissions per head, India should basically do what it likes until it gets semi-developed, more than halfway up or something of that sort, then joining in this climate change thing. But at the moment, the developed countries can't really get their act together on that, and nor is the world getting its act together on that. That's just putting that in for discussion later. And I want to just say a little bit about energy prices and distribution objectives. Can those be reconciled? And the basic point I'll state it starkly, that for all sorts of reasons to do with the development of supply, to do with resource allocation and all the rest of it, you should be having energy prices in a place like India or China, which roughly reflect international prices. And in some cases that is the case, in some cases it is not. That's just looking at, if you like, economic efficiency. But what about distribution? If many of your farmers, for example, depend on fertilizer, which depends on gas, how do you actually do the distributional thing sensibly whilst you've got this overall problem going on? Now I'm going to put up just a few charts, and I'm going to run through these very, very quickly because I don't regard them as terribly important. The first one is just what does India look like in the world? GDP, what, 4%, population a great deal bigger than that, that's no surprise to anybody. Coal production, not particularly, well, it's big, but it's not big compared with China or the United States, as I said. I think don't really want to, they've got very little oil production, very little oil reserves, very little gas reserves, and rather little gas production. This is just illustrating what I said, that this is a coal economy. The point I want to bring up here is that renewables, which take about 99% of seminars on the future of energy and so on, wind and solar and all that sort of thing, are at the moment extremely small. Up there, I think, I know Palmer help me, it's total 5. The percentage of renewables, which is actually they have other renewables, is sort of not very high. Now that concludes the traditional biofuels. you know, dung and all that kind of thing, firewood and so on. So if you're actually talking about what one thinks of as renewables, wind and biofuels or biocrops and those kinds of things, renewables is terribly, terribly small internationally. BP says they ignore various things, but they say renewables are about 2%. They're expected to grow extremely fast, but even if you grow extremely fast and you start at 2%, you're not really cutting into the, you know, the big problems of the world, and the same is true, let's face it, in India. That's just saying that most electricity in India is produced by electricity. There is some gas, and nuclear is going to come on sometime, 2 plus 3. India is a good citizen of the world in terms of emissions per capita. That's a nice thing to say, but it's for a rather nasty reason, and that is that there are an awful lot of people, and they're very, very poor, and that's why emissions per capita are extremely low. The red line shows emissions per capita, relatively. It's probably half the world. China, on PPP basis, using proper exchange rates, is about average for the world, and you see the well-known fact that the United States is way up there. If you did the same calculations as people sometimes do on official exchange rates, you'd see much more energy intensity in India and China. I know the exact figure for China, it's 2.38 times as intensive on official exchange rates. I think India, the ratio is even bigger, something like 3, and that's because of the way one's valuing things like agriculture, government services and so on in these countries. The exchange rate doesn't really reflect an international comparison very well. But at the moment, India is not, so to speak, on per capita terms, a big emitter. If the big emitter is obviously the United States. Warm. Import dependency, coal is mostly domestically produced. There are pretty vast reserves. A recent feature is that imports of coal are rising pretty quickly. Most of this represents a huge problem of reorganising and reforming the coal sector itself. There's all sorts of problems, I won't go into them. Here, lignite, thank God, they're not importing that. Oil, it's roughly 70% import dependent, which means that the options of trying to sort things out by oil or indeed meeting transport demands as India goes forward at hopefully fast rates of growth, which I think are quite well established, is going to be a really serious problem, a bigger and bigger drain on the balance payments and on the budget. Remember that oil is at $115, $111 a day, actually. Well, at that price, it's jolly expensive stuff. Natural gas is, again, was mostly domestic, but it was very small in the general mix, but it's beginning to be imported as well, LNG. And hydro, we can talk about that when we get into discussion. And I'm going to sort of shoot on. What do people think if they're being kind of, on the sort of realist wing as opposed to the climate change wing? This is slightly dated. IEA did a pretty big study of India and China in 2007. Is that right, Andrew? 2007. There were a lot more detail than usual on these two areas, and this is from there. And what it shows, this is looking forward to 2030, that actually the proportion of coal in China and India, well, in India, it's actually expected to rise somewhat over the future, and that's really bad news for anybody who's interested in climate change. And you see the contribution of the other bits. Oil not very much, gas a little bit, but that depends a lot on how much imports they make and how much gas is found in offshore and elsewhere. Nuclear, still fairly small, but expected to get quite a lot bigger, reflecting recent policy changes, and I'm sure there's going to be a debate about that. And hydro, well, most countries will do as much as they can, because it's the obvious thing to do if you can, but there's a limited number of places where you can do it. So I'm just coming back to the stylized facts. Huge challenge, just in meeting the demands which will go with growth. You can become more efficient, but there's limits to that. Need for reform, particularly in coal and electricity, unbelievably distorted. One of the problems in electricity is that there's a huge degree of cross-subsidization between urban consumers, industry on the one hand, and the agricultural sector on the other. An awful lot of people, in fact, pay very, very little or nothing for their electricity. And this is all sort of lost within the state industries and state generation and distribution industry. So that's a long way from reform, I think, at the moment. Even without decarbonisation, just simple facts suggest that wind, solar, all those things are jolly expensive. And so is LNG compared with, for example, the price of gas within India. So most of the alternatives suggest you're going to have higher prices, either because you're wanting to stimulate supply and domestic resources, or because you're going to have to import it and the prices are going to be higher than in the future, almost certainly. So what's going on is a sort of piecemeal reform. Some sectors are actually quite reformed. One of the ones where the debate has in effect been won in India is oil. It's now the case that the price of petrol at the pump is about the same in Delhi as in New York. So who is subsidizing and who isn't? Both New York and Delhi are subsidizing relative to standard European price or UK prices or something of that sort. But in terms of not, so that's in terms of not taxing, and they probably should be taxing. But India is not like the Middle East where you're getting, liters and liters of sort of a cent a barrel and so on, and huge subsidies to hydrocarbons and petrochemicals and so on. India and China are not like that. They've moved oil prices. It took a long time because everybody says, oh, you can't put up petrol prices or diesel prices because what about the poor farmers, the poor taxi drivers, the poor fishermen, etc., etc. Well, everyone has it. A couple of really good World Bank reports pointed out what is absolutely obvious, and that is it's the middle classes who gain from cheap petrol prices. And India has been sensible enough to actually take that on board and actually move in the right direction. It's not easy, they did do it, etc. On diesel, there is a subsidy above a certain oil price level, partly reflecting things like public transport and pressure groups, and they attempted to subsidise some hydrocarbons which are particularly important to the poor, kerosene used for cooking, LPG used for cooking, and certain kinds of diesel. And if anyone thinks that that's just the kind of things that happen in developing countries, remember that in this country we subsidise diesel for farmers. I've no idea why, by the way, but it's called red diesel, which is taxed much less than ordinary diesel because the farmers' lobby has been strong enough over, God knows, 50 years or so in order to maintain that. So every country does this, and it's probably quite sensible, except I don't think it's sensible to subsidise large Land Rovers and things for farmers in the UK. I want to move on just to say a little bit about gas as something that exemplifies one or two sort of the issues in this sort of area. Sorry, I don't want that one. I do want to just reinforce what I was saying about prices. This just looks at prices compared with international prices, and you'll see that despite going up and down, these are nominal terms, oil prices in India, the sort of crude prices that they pass around and so on, they're not the retail prices. They're actually more or less at international levels. So you could say job done, more or less on there. Coal prices are extremely low relative to international prices, if you look at the right-hand one. And gas prices are also the same. And I want to draw attention, this is a controlled gas price, or allocated gas price. What was it, $180 per MMBTU? And then very recently, with reform, they bunged it up to 4.2. This is a major, major change within India. It's a major reform, and it's clearly in the right direction. It actually probably puts it up to roughly American gas price levels. It certainly does not put it up to anything like an Asian LNG gas price, i.e. the opportunity cost at the frontier. That would have to be up at at least 6, but more likely 8 to 12. And you can see that there's quite a long way still to go. It's a highly contentious issue. We have an expert on this, Anu Palmer, sitting there, if anybody wants to raise it in greater detail in discussion. Gas is interesting. I mean, if you start with central planning, and India does, there are two aspects of central planning in general which fit very well with the sort of transition experience in India. One is quantitative allocation to particular sectors and so on. That's reflected, was reflected, still reflected in India in something called the gas utilisation policy. It was mainly on the input. Now think for this purpose, not power. Gas is not terribly important in the power sector in India. Think fertilisers, because the feedstock for fertilisers is gas, and they're going more and more towards gas rather than urea to do that. The way they were getting the subsidy to keep the price of urea, nitrogen fertiliser down was through a low urea or gas price, subsidised input, and as I've said, that an economist would say that's probably going to get as many distortions as you can possibly think of into the mix. What they've done recently, when they moved the price up to about $4.2, sort of at least half the way, quite a lot, it's a big reform, let's face it, big reform towards sanity, that would then immediately pass through the state-owned companies which are producing the fertiliser and lead to higher prices for fertiliser, raising all sorts of distribution objectives. Now the intermediate stage that they decided on was basically to do that not by subsidising the gas, they put the gas price up, but they subsidise it from the general budget. Now that is actually far less distorted than doing it through the input. You can just work it out in terms of fuel substitution, all sorts of things. It's a much better thing to do. It's not the end of the process. I think it's experimental at the moment, but they are experimenting with the idea of unique personal identification numbers, which will allow them to actually pick out the poor families that are the poor agriculturalists whom they actually want to target with the cheap fertiliser, and to actually do it that way. There are other ways you can do it. The obviously best way to do it is to stop them being poor so they can afford the market prices, economic prices. That's a long way from that. But targeting it so it's not actually subsidising the vast rich billionaires at the same time as you're targeting the farmers is, if you like, the next stage. This is all terribly well known in India, that they're moving in that direction in sector after sector, but it's very difficult and it's very slow and raises all sorts of problems. Now this gas is sort of halfway to transition, is what I'm saying. If you were to turn from there to really big sectors like coal and electricity, I think halfway would be a very large overestimate of where they're starting from. In other words, what you've seen in oil, which is more or less quite complete, but nearly complete, what you're seeing in gas actually has to be then passed over to other sectors, the other resource sectors in the economy, and that will be really quite difficult. I know there are at least 2 people studying Indian electricity for various Anu Palmer and the next speaker. Well, good luck. It's very interesting and it's going to be very political. Summary: need to reform and a joined-up energy strategy just to meet the demand. The conflict between efficiency and distribution, terribly well illustrated but not solved in terms of the discussion. A focus on targeted subsidies, very difficult, but it sort of makes kind of sense looking forward. What about decarbonisation, especially backing out coal? Just think of it. Generally increases the tension between distributional and efficiency objectives by a very large amount, because the alternatives are either imported or very expensive. So it just makes it a lot worse if you put that one in as well. And I end by saying it's quite a challenge, which I hope the speakers coming after me are going to solve. Thanks.
I think Asaf did a great job and did my job easier, made my job easier. But the dimension will be different in my presentation to you, because yes, the question is very pertinent, that India's energy needs over not only the next in the immediate future, but deep into the long into the future. How can we meet that energy, and whether we will be able to meet our obligation to the environment, and how do we do that? Do we have the resources enough within the country to do it? And that is what I will be speaking about. Well, after Fukushima, there has been some questions, some concerns among public about the safety of nuclear power worldwide. But what you already know is that in the world today there are 496 reactors operating, and it is only Japan which out of its 54 reactors have shut down because of some reasons which have come later. So the question really is whether India really needs nuclear power to meet its energy requirement, and if not, whether India can meet the growing energy needs in a manner which is in accordance with the international efforts to reduce carbon emission. And also lastly, whether India can handle a large nuclear program in a safe manner, because it is also important that the safety of nuclear power is also should be maintained. Okay, I'll take resort to pictures because I thought this will make it more easy to understand and also for me to explain. And please pardon me if there are small differences in your figures and mine.
You're probably right, I was thinking.
Okay, so here we can see, as also mentioned, that we are a coal economy. We are depending heavily on coal, and renewables, as per this figure, is only 12%, generating 25 gigawatt. And you can see the total electricity generation today in India is 208 gigawatt. I think I'll focus on electrical energy generation only, because if we talk about energy, it also includes energy being consumed in the transport and other sectors. And of course, gas is 20 gigawatt, 10%, and nuclear, I can't even see here, it's 2.3%, and about 4.8 gigawatt. But in doing that, you can see here we are generating 208 gigawatts in India, but we are located fifth in the largest energy generating countries. But when you see, when you look at the per capita consumption, which as also mentioned, we are down here. So you can imagine we are the fifth largest energy generating country in the world. But if you see the per capita consumption, which is an indication of the well-being of a person and the human development in a country, we are just 600 kilowatt hour per person per year, and whereas the world average is 2,500. And just a small information that Norway happens to be the topmost in the per capita consumption, and India ranks somewhere around 135th in the list of countries. And this is what has been projected for the next 50 years. The government plans to improve the quality of life of an average Indian, and from the present 600 odd kilowatt hours per person, the intention is to raise it to 5,300 by the year 2052. And you can imagine it's a monumental task. And the size of the country and the size of the population, we can never achieve this target with any single source of energy. We have to see how we can utilize all the sources of energy available in a very sustainable manner. And also, it is also important that whatever energy is produced is ultimately coming from the from the Indian resources, because national security also means energy security. Sorry, energy security also means national security. Well, this is the energy resource base at the moment in India, where these figures are slightly updated now. Coal should be around 100 billion ton at the moment, and you can imagine the energy potential would be also equally higher. And uranium in the country, unfortunately we have very little uranium in the country, and it's about 90,000 tons as per the latest resource information, and this can give an energy potential of about 400 gigawatt year. But when we use this fuel, I can just tell you, we'll come to the slides next, because when we use this fuel in this uranium reactors, in the fast breeder reactors, we can get a huge energy potential of 42,000 gigawatt years. And ultimately, you must be aware that India is endowed with a large resource of thorium metal, but scientifically and technically, this thorium cannot be used immediately at the moment. So we have to go in stages, which I will explain later. So this is just a comparison of how much our resources can last. So if at the present rate, it's assumed to be 697 terawatt hours, coal will last about 130 years, and uranium will last about 4 years. And if this uranium and it is used in the fast breeder reactors, it will last for 211 years. And if thorium is being tapped for the energy generation, then it will be lasting about 1,950 years at the present rate of consumption. But if you take the rate of consumption which is expected to be there in 2050, then these are the figures. And you can see still that thorium can provide at that rate 170 years of electricity generation. So the Indian government realized that the growth is required for the country at the rate of 8 to 10% of GDP. And in 2007, it adopted an energy policy, and this policy was recommended by a team of eminent personalities and departments in the country, and this is what it is easily available on the website. It's called the Integrated Energy Policy, and here you can see, you may not be able to see from there, that about 15 to 20 different departments in the country were involved in looking at the resources available within the country, and these were the challenges which were given to them to recommend what kind of energy mix India should pursue in the next 25 years. And it is the first time that this kind of an exercise was done in India. So the factors were that it should provide a long-term energy security, and it should be accessible. That means the resource, whatever is in India, is accessible, and the energy should be available very easily to the common man, and it should be affordable and efficient, and of course lastly it has to be in line with the environment and the So as per the energy policy adopted by the government, this will be the projection for 2032, because the policy was for the moment prepared for the next 25 years. So when this was adopted in 2007, this is the projection of electricity generation which will be required to meet a growth of about 9% of GDP. So you can see here that coal has come down. In the earlier slide you could see coal was about 60%, and now you can see it depends only about 39%, but still it's having a big share. And of course renewable goes up, and nuclear, you can see from the present 4 gigawatt it has to go to 63 gigawatt, so 15 times. And you can see the confidence on nuclear being a clean energy source, and also confidence on the capability which is developed over the past 50 years in India on nuclear. Of course, the policy also doesn't discount the sources from solar and wind and hydro and others. So you may have heard about these figures. That the solar mission, there is a solar mission which has been created in India, and it is trying to see how best to tap the solar energy, and this is the target which has been set by the solar mission to achieve about 20 gigawatt, at least 20 gigawatt by 2022. And of course, we all know that solar energy, as per the technology available, that is by photovoltaic or by solar thermal, it needs a large area. And this is the area which the experts have calculated that at 2052 consumption rate, the area required is this much. Of course, if the technology further develops, maybe we will be able to manage with lesser areas. And today I can say that in India, there is a lot of activity in the renewable energy like wind and solar. And recently, if you have heard that the home solar process is also introduced, because this is assumed to be very, very economical and easily installed on your homes, and it is being already used in some villages. But one major concern here is the cost from solar energy is higher, because the capacity factor is also pretty low. And when you connect the solar energy, sorry. When you connect the solar generator to the grid, we have to create grid parity, because the cost of the solar energy is high. Till some time back, it was about 10 to 12 rupees per kilowatt hour. Now it is slowly coming down. So with the advancement of technology, we expect that the cost will further come down. So what the Indian government is doing in some states is that it is trying to impress upon the local, the state to introduce at least some minimum content of solar energy or renewable energy generation, and also putting some kind of I should not say pressure, but incentive on the consumer that okay, you also buy this solar renewable energy, so that it is encouraged to the right extent. And similarly, wind also, I think there have been a recent evaluation done, and there is a potential of 45 gigawatt. This has been estimated by an organization called CWET, but there are some independent projections which indicate that a maximum potential of 100 gigawatt can be achieved in India by using higher what you call wind turbines. And also hydro, we already know that there is a separate organization to manage hydro energy. It's called the National Hydro Power Electric Company, and it has evaluated and found that about 84 gigawatt could be is the maximum potential. And these are the projects which are going on at the moment. But again, for hydro also, the capacity factor is about 60%. So if you see the renewable energy sources like solar or wind or hydro, we have to install more capacity to get lesser available sources because of its inherent capacity factor issues. Okay, this looks to be a very complicated picture, but I'll try to make it simpler. So, as per the policy, as I said, in 2050, the plan is to provide 5,000 kilowatt hour per person per year, so that the per capita consumption and the living conditions of the average Indian is improved. So, to achieve this, and this is the projected position of the growth of energy requirement, and this curve really shows that we will reach only 593 kilowatt hour per year if we exclude coal and nuclear. So this gap has to be filled by either coal or nuclear. This amounts to about 1094 gigawatts. So that's why it says nuclear share must increase multifold to meet energy demands, if we have to really meet the environmental requirements. Okay, so sorry, I think this slide has come in between, but I'll try to explain this. Now, you must have heard about IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the UN body which oversees the promotion of nuclear and also the safety of nuclear energy all around the world. And we have got 436 reactors, and as per the current estimate, there are about the availability of uranium can support about 570 gigawatt. At the moment, the nuclear installed capacity all around the world is 370 gigawatt. So with the present availability of uranium, we can reach about 570 gigawatt only, and by this year. So now this slide also will explain that why recycling of fuel is so important. And most of the countries today, they have a once-through cycle of utilization of uranium. Even the US or most of the countries like Sweden and every country, they have once-through cycle. They don't bring back the spent fuel to use the remaining useful content of the fuel. Fortunately, India, they got a program which plans recycling of a fuel. That is a closed fuel cycle, we call it. So this is where India will be at an advantage, that if we start recycling early, then we'll be able to use our uranium resources in a better way and add to the capacity of generating electricity. And this graph also basically shows a similar thing, that in 2050 we need about 1250 gigawatt of electricity to meet the same target. And if we don't import a reactor or fuel, basically why we want to import fuel is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, that our uranium available in the country can support only a minimum capacity. So that is why for some time we have to import some fuel, some reactors to make sure that this gap is bridged. Otherwise, this has to be met through coal. So here you can see that hydroelectric capacity is this much and slowly growing, and then you have coal, which is also growing, but of course the percentage of coal is reducing, and here you have hydrocarbon, and then using all the three stages of nuclear program India has today, we will be achieving only this level. So that means this deficit will be important to meet, and this is how the next slide will tell us that how this importing of fuel and reactor technology helps in bridging that gap. And here you are. So if basically the fuel which will come along with the imported reactors will help in meeting the fuel requirements of the fast breeder reactors, because this is the gap which is being filled by the fuel being used in fast breeder reactors. So you can see that this mix of energy will be able to finally meet our requirements in 2050. Of course, when we say that nuclear energy will be able to support the other sources of energy to meet our energy requirement, it also means that it needs a will from the policy makers. And fortunately for India, the government has really gone by the recommendations of the scientific community, and it has got sufficient faith and trust on the nuclear community also. And in the next slides you will be able to see how this confidence has been developed. And the first nuclear activity was in 1954 when the Department of Atomic Energy was formed, and which was formed for doing research and development in nuclear science and many other things which was to help the society. And it is one of the few countries to have adopted a closed fuel cycle. And the other countries are France, Japan, Russia, and Germany, who do not throw their fuel after using the reactor. They bring it back, reprocess it, and use it for the next stage. So this is the best utilization of our resource. And of course, you may also be aware that in 1974, India tested its nuclear device, and from that time onwards, and at that time we had only 2 reactors operating. One was a Canadian technology, the other was an American technology, and in 1974 the international community decided to put an embargo on India, that India will not be able to get access to any nuclear material from outside. And from that time onwards, it was a difficult task for the people to adopt the technology and also take it forward, because we didn't have any option to go back, because we know that we have got a good thorium reserve and we have to go to that stage to utilize it. So, and at that time the industry was not at all ready to support nuclear at the moment. So it was a painful job. It was taken up to develop the industry, and today we are very happy to say that the nuclear industry is very much matured, because nuclear plants have been built over the last few years regularly, and the industry is very, very vibrant. And I'm very happy also to tell you that the Indian industry is also going to, one of the Indian industries is going to supply the main vessel for the fusion reactor in France, and also it has supplied very critical equipments to French companies. Of course, international recognition, well, it means that our experts are participating now after the nuclear suppliers group permitted India to again participate in nuclear commerce. Our experts have started participating in many international forums, and Indian experts have been jointly working with French and Russian and American scientists, and it has been proved that Indian scientists were no less. And India is also partnered in the CERN, where we have the Large Hadron Collider, and India is also one of the 7 units in the ITER, which is the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. And India has its own fusion program as well, because this is looking further into the future, that after we consume all the other resources, maybe even 2050 or so, we must have something in our pocket to meet the energy requirements. And we have a good fusion program, and after our engagement in ITER, this program will further take off. And when I was saying that we have a closed fuel cycle, it means that when the uranium which is mined from the mines is basically natural uranium, which is used in the first stage of reactors. We have a 3-stage program. In the first stage, uranium is used, and the depleted uranium and plutonium which comes out of the spent fuel, it goes into the fast reactors. And this is how the capacity increases in the fast reactors. These reactors are called breeder reactors. A breeder reactor means that when you put plutonium and uranium-238, plutonium is the fuel, and uranium-38 breeds into plutonium-39. Plutonium-239. So this is how these reactors are much more potent reactors. And since we have thorium in huge quantities, that thorium can go as blanket into these reactors and convert into uranium-233, and then uranium-33 will go into the next stage of reactors. So these three stages which I was mentioning are going to meet our requirements in the 2050s.
My background is not technical, it's not even in economics, so you may, well, I'll defer first to you guys on all of those issues, but you may wonder what I'm doing here. And I would argue that energy policy is, of course, not only a technical issue, possibly not even primarily a technical issue, it's a political one. So I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the political issues that Chris sort of flagged up. So the first thing I want to say is I'm not talking about what India should do. I'm not taking a normative stance here. I'm talking about what is politically feasible. And India has both the highest natural resource constraints of any of the BRIC economies. I think it also probably has the highest political and economic constraints on its energy security. And therefore it's my contention that I'm a little more sceptical about the ability of nuclear to meet that statistic that I think you have in your brochure of 470,000 megawatts within about 4 decades. I think it does have a great deal of future, and I very much hope that closed cycle reactors come about. I have faith in thorium and in the Indian nuclear establishment, but there are a number of other problems that I'd like to talk about, and I'd like to focus as well slightly more on the medium term rather than focusing forward to 2050. One thing that it's worth saying at the outset is that historical evidence shows that energy transitions take a remarkably long time, which is, well, actually not that surprising, I suppose. But, so for example, the transition from coal to oil worldwide as the most important fuel, or, you know, to an oil-based series of economies, took about a century. I mean, the average lifespan of a power plant can be as high as 60 years. And energy systems are so large that they take an awfully long time to rejig. So the first thing to say is that there's not going to be any instant change that we see. And the second is that whilst there could be technological breakthroughs, what happens now in the immediate to medium term will still be having long-run effects for decades in the future on India's energy portfolio. So broadly then, I think that India's energy portfolio, because of these reasons of political feasibility and path dependency, is going to look very similar in 2030, at least, to what it does now. I suspect that perhaps the share of coal will stagnate rather than continue to rise, but that's simply looking at the problems that exist now. There are already some indications, for example, that with the slowing growth in China, more coal is becoming available for India. And of course, as was mentioned, as US shale displaces US coal, that will free up supply elsewhere. On other fronts, of course, India also is likely to benefit from gas from, say, Qatar, which has previously exported a lot to the US. So yes, reliance on natural gas, I think, is quite likely to increase, although in the short to medium term at least, it won't be a particularly steep increase, and it will be used mostly for what is called peaking power, as in to match the peaks in demand, rather than taking an overall more important role, I think, speaking to people. People in the gas establishment in India are very pessimistic at the moment. I think we will see the share of renewables rise. I don't think that wind will maybe be at all India's answer. I think that the experience of Tamil Nadu is showing the dangers of large wind capacity. About 45% of the installed capacity in the state is supposed to be wind. Of course, because as you've seen, the capacity to actual generation in renewables is so low, its overall energy portfolio is not entirely affected by that, but the problems of intermittency of wind really do affect Tamil Nadu, and I think it's reckoned to be about 20% of the energy portfolio. After that, there's a tipping point at which it becomes a bit risky, you know, to have too much wind and define this energy security priority that we flagged up here. Incidentally, the more recent figures on India's coal supply are not the 130 years at current usage. There's a series of very strange calculations that have gone on Indian energy, which I can talk about if you're interested, but I think now even the Indian coal establishment accepts it. It's more like 40 years. Anyway, so I see some very bright spots moving forward. One of these, in fact, is flagged up by the fact that we're focusing on energy security now, which is, in New Delhi energy circles, one of the sort of mantras on everybody's lips. And the great thing is that the way that that energy security discourse is playing out in India neatly sort of can be combined with an emphasis on renewables and energy efficiency. So that potential exists. I have to say that this is not something that the West realizes at all, that for India this is, of course, development with sustainability co-benefits rather than the other way around, and probably bodies like the EU could have way more leverage if they recast some of their initiatives. And I'm fairly optimistic on some of these, more so than media reports might suggest, because I think although India takes a very intransigent position in international negotiations, actually on the ground there's quite a lot happening in the fields of energy efficiency and renewables. The Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission, for example, was mentioned. The Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, sort of, its reputation is on the up, and the Bureau of Energy Efficiency as well is headed by a very dynamic leader and has a big budget. So I think there are some sort of encouraging trends there in terms of the policy space that is open and potential developments in solar. Of course, there have been some teething pains, but the National Solar Mission has looked pretty successful. The examples in Gujarat look reasonably positive, so it would be something to watch out for. So that's on the kind of environmentally sustainable side of the question at the heart of this panel. But what about the energy security side in terms of just, can India produce enough energy? Well, already there are quite a lot of Cassandras about. I mean, Standard & Poor's in June debated whether India might become the fallen angel of the BRICS very shortly, and energy woes are certainly one of the major reasons behind these doubts. I'm slightly less pessimistic than that, but I think that at least until the next general election, India will have a very tough time energy-wise, and there are some huge decisions to be taken. On some of the targets that have been put forward to nuclear, and I should say that I'm tentatively in favour of nuclear, I'm not an anti-nuclear hawk. I have to say that the Indian government has a fairly disastrous record of target setting in the energy sector. These targets are quite often missed even in the 5-year plans with their limited time horizons. So for example, for the capacity addition targets, the 9th and 10th plans met only 50% of the target. The 11th, it was hoped to be 80, but with the last year's events, it looks more to be a bit lower than that, maybe 2/3. Obviously, once we're projecting out much beyond that, these are just taken as headline figures rather than as based on a series of different scenarios, then these become slightly shaky. I think another thing to be aware of is the reason that some of these statistics get propagated is that the Indian state is far from unified. I mean, most obviously, of course, it is now more de facto federal than it ever was before, which is having enormous effects on the room to manoeuvre in energy policy. But also, unlike most countries, there is no single energy ministry. So you have, for example, enormous powerful ministries like the Ministry of Power, Coal, and so on, the Department of Atomic Energy, and then and petroleum and natural gas, new and renewable energy, and then of course you have all of these ministries with very direct interests like railways and fertilizers. So it's a very difficult, conflictual process often. We heard about the integrated energy policy in 2007, which is a fabulously worded document, which has some fabulous concepts as well, and is the closest thing India has to an integrated energy policy. Of course, it was put together by under the aegis of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission does not have the power to bang heads together really in the energy ministries, and it depends very much on personal relationships, how that dynamic works. I'll skip over talking about nuclear, except to say I'm a little skeptical about, firstly, clearly the amount of civil society activism around it, around all big energy projects, means that this is very problematic. And this is not something that sort of rational education campaigns really can necessarily change. I mean, when you have somebody like Arundhati Roy saying that big dams are the equivalent of weapons of mass destruction, then, you know, you've got your work sort of cut out. I have to say, I think the Indian nuclear establishment is very protective of its secrecy, and maybe that makes people also worried. And its regulator is also, like many of the regulators in the energy sector in India, its autonomy is questioned, as well as foreign technology comes in. There will be a sort of catch-up game. I'm also slightly skeptical because since the Indo-US nuclear deal, obviously, and the arrival of this technology in, I would love to hear your thoughts on the effect that this is having on India's indigenous self-sufficient capacity. I have even seen, so Australia also may start selling uranium to India. I have even seen an Australian working paper saying that by doing this they will undercut India's own efforts at, say, closed-cycle thorium-based reactors and so on, and retard the development of the domestic industry. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that is perceived. Of course, there is internationally a question about the affordability of nuclear, and I think that's really the problem that I have with it in the Indian context. Of course, there are all of the moral as well as practical considerations about opting for the non-least cost option. And because of the massive upfront costs of nuclear as well, I think it's problematic in India, both if it's state-funded or because of the expensiveness of capital. And I sort of worry that, obviously Kudankulam is being pushed ahead, but Jetapur in Maharashtra is still very, very problematic. The aforementioned French company involved is in financially dire straits, I was told. And therefore I wonder whether this could be almost an Enron double moment that retards this financial investment for a little while. So although I hope that India cracks the thorium cycle and meets the utopian aspirational targets that it has had for thorium for several decades now, and would in that case even become an energy exporter, if some of these projections are to be believed, I have my doubts about nuclear. I have to say there are some positive signs though, not least that Jayalalitha's U-turn came because of the widespread energy crisis in Tamil Nadu, which to me suggests that at point of crisis, then a political crisis, then genuine large changes can be leveraged. I won't talk really about shale here, except to say that I think there is a lot of buzz about it in India, but the estimates I've seen of Indian shale resources put it at an order of magnitude smaller than China's. So briefly, I want to mention what I see as one of the crucial overlooked dimensions of this issue of energy security and environmental sustainability in the sector. I think often the focus is on fuel sources and on the generation side. That is clearly, on a worldwide scale and in the longer term, the absolute most critical thing. I think in the short to medium term, though, something that is really undermining efforts in the Indian power sector to improve is this crippling financial weakness that was mentioned. The state electricity boards, which offer these large subsidies, usually to agricultural users, but also which tolerate an enormous degree of electricity theft, are, well, many of them are almost broke, or they have been broke and are repeatedly bailed out. At various points, it's been the single largest burden on the state budgets, and up to approaching 2% of India's entire GDP. I think that what we should remember is that this not only discourages private investment in the sector, it also discourages investment, I mean, in generation, but also in transmission and distribution, which are, you know, the less sexy sides potentially, but you know, the critically important bottlenecks in some ways. For example, lots of the solar coming online cannot be evacuated. And finally, because there is so much theft, it, you know, estimates around 30%. It means that for all of this coal-based electricity that's being generated, you know, a third, well, a huge chunk of it, half again, is sort of being wasted. So again, I think this is something that we ought to bear in mind. That the current proposals aren't working. I think I don't want to take too much of your time, so I'll cut this off now. But I think that hopefully after the next general election, there will be more ability to take a hard line between the centre and the states, or for states to make some tough decisions. Possibly if there are power crises in the states, it will become more palatable to do that. So sorry if that's a slightly bleak picture of the Indian energy scenario, at least in the short term. I am more optimistic than that in the medium term. And obviously you can ask me about this in the questions. And although I'm not very optimistic about rural electrification, I have to say, because I think of the logic of liberalisation that's hit the sector, and some of the most widespread examples that I think will be replicated, Gujarat being one.